This is the story of Bonny's Big Day by James Harriet.
Who's little Bonny?
Bonny is this horse here, I think, because she's the one right out in the front. One sunny morning in early September, I drove to see old John Skipton at Dale Close Farm.
To the right.
Since he had telephoned to say that his cart horses, one of his cart horses, was lame. As I got out of the car, the untidily dressed figure of the farmer came through the kitchen door of Dale Close. John always seemed to look like a scarecrow, and today was no different. He was wearing a tattered, buttonless coat, which was tied round his waist with a string. See, there is the string.
Stop for a second.
His trousers were much too short, and as he hurried towards me, I could see that he was wearing socks of different colors, one red and the other blue. There's one red sock and one blue sock. By working very hard when he was a young man, Mr. Skipton had saved enough money to buy his own farm with its handsome stone house. He had never married, and because he always was too busy looking after sheep and cows in the hills and bringing in the harvest from the fields and picking apples in the orchard, he had been much too busy to worry about himself, which is why he always dressed in the very, very old clothes. The horses were down by the river, he said in his usual gruff manner. We'll have to go down there. He seized a pitchfork and stabbed at a pile of hay, which he then hoisted onto his shoulder. There he is, walking with the pile of hay. I pulled my Gladstone bag from the car and set off behind him. It was difficult to keep up with the farmer's brisk pace, even though he must have been 50 years older than me. I was glad when we reached the bottom of the hill because the bag was heavy and I was getting rather hot. I saw the two horses standing in the shallow, pebbly river. They were nose to tail and were rubbing their chins gently along each other's back. Beyond them, a carpet of green turf ran up to a high, sheltered ridge, while all around clumps of oak and beech blazed in the autumn sunshine. All these big trees. They're in a nice place, Mr. Skipton, I said. Aye, they can keep cool in hot weather, and they've got the barn in the winter. At the sound of his voice, the two horses came trotting up from the river, the gray one first, and the chestnut followed a little more slowly and limping slightly. They were fine cart horses, but I could see they were old from the sprinkling of white hairs on their faces. Despite their age, however, they pranced along around old John, stamping their enormous feet and throwing their heads about and pushing the farmer's cap over his eyes with their muzzles. Get over, leave off, he cried. See the horses pushing at him? He pulled at the gray horse's forelock. This is Bonny. She's well over 20 years old. Wow, she is getting up there. Then he ran his hand down the front leg of the chestnut. And this is Dolly. She's nearly 30 now, and not one day sickness until now. When did they last do any work, I asked. Oh, about 12 years ago, I reckon, the farmer replied. I stared at him in amazement. 12 years? Have they been down here all that time? I just playing about down here. They've earned their retirement. For a few seconds he stood silent, shoulders hunched, hands deep in the pockets of his tattered coat. They worked very hard when I had to struggle to get this farm going, he murmured. And I knew he was thinking of the long years those horses had pulled the plow, drawn the hay and harvest wagons, and done all the hard work which the tractors do now. I noticed that Dolly was a bit lame when I came down with their hay yesterday, he said. Luckily, I come down each day. You mean that you climb down that hillside every single day? I asked. Aye, rain, wind, or snow, they looked forward to me bringing a few oats and some hay. I examined Dolly's foot and found an old nail embedded deep in the soft part of her foot. I was able to pull it out quite easily with a pair of pincers, and then gave her some anti-tetanus, some medicine to eliminate any risk of later infection. Climbing back up the hill, I couldn't help but thinking how wonderful it was that old John had made the long journey to see the horses in all weathers, every day for 12 years. He certainly loved those great animals. A thought struck me, and I turned to him. You know, Mr. Skipton, it's the Doorway show next Saturday. You should enter the mares in the family pet class. I know that I know they are asking for unusual entries this year. Perhaps you should only take Bonny, since Dolly's foot will be a bit sore for a few days. Farmer frowned. What on earth are you talking about? Go on, I said. Take Bonny to the show. Those horses are your pets, aren't they? Pets, he snorted. You couldn't tell one of those great big clodhoppers a pet. I never heard anything so silly. When he got back to the farmyard, he thanked me gruffly, gave me a nod, and disappeared into his house. The following Saturday, it was my duty to attend Derby show as the vet in charge. I had spent a pleasant time strolling around the showground, looking at the pens of the cattle and the sheep, the children's ponies, the massive bulls, and the sheepdog trials in the neighboring fields. Then, over the loudspeaker, came the following announcement.
Go.
Would the entrants for the family pet class please take their places in the ring? I was always interested in this event, so I walked over and stood by the secretary, who was sitting at a table near the edge of the ring. He was Darby's local bank manager, a prim little man with rimless spectacles and a pork pie hat. I could see that he was pleased at the number of entrants now filing into the ring. He looked at me and beamed. They have certainly taken me at my word when I asked for unusual entries this year. The parade was led by a fine white nanny goat, which was followed by a pink piglet. Apart from numerous cats and dogs of all shapes and sizes, there was a goldfish in its bowl and at least 5 rabbits. There was a parrot on a perch and some budgies having an outing in their cage. Then, to an excited buzz of conversation, a man walked into the ring with a hooded falcon on his wrist. Splendid, splendid, cried Mr. Secretary. But then his mouth fell open and everyone stopped talking as a most unexpected sight appeared. Old John Skipton came striding into the ring, and he was leading Bonny. But it was a different man and a different horse than I had seen a few days before. John still wore the same old tattered coat tied with a string, but today I noticed that both his socks were the same color, and on his head, perched right in the center, was an ancient bowler hat. It made him look almost smart, but not as smart as Bonny. She was dressed in full show regalia of an old-fashioned cart horse. Her hooves were polished and oiled. The old leathery hair on her lower limbs had been washed and fluffed out. Her mane, tail, and forelock had been braided with green and yellow ribbons, and her coat had been groomed until it shone in the sunshine. She was wearing part of the harness from her working days, and it too had been polished, and little bells hung from the collar. It quite took my breath away to look at her. Wow, look at all the braids down her neck there. And I think her tail is even braided. She looks quite pretty. Mr. Skipton, you can't bring that great thing in here. This is a class for family pets, cried Mr. Secretary, leaping up from his chair. Bonny is my pet, replied the farmer. She's part of my family, just like an old goat over there. Just like that old goat over there. Well, I disagree, said Mr. Secretary, waving his arms. You must take her out of the ring and go home. Old John Skipton put on a fierce face and glared at the man. Bonny is my pet, he repeated. Just ask Mr. Harriet. I shrugged my shoulders. Perfectly true. This mare hasn't worked for over 12 years and is kept entirely for Mr. Skipton's pleasure. I'd certainly call Bonny a pet. But, sputtered Mr. Secretary. Then he sat down suddenly on his chair and sighed. Oh, very well then. Go and get into line. So John turned and led Bonny to a place in the middle of all the other competitors. On the one side of them was a little pink piglet, on the other side a tortoise. It was a curious sight. There's a little tortoise, and there's a little rabbit, and a pink pig. The task of judging the pets had been given to the district nurse, who was very sensibly dressed in her official uniform to give her an air of authority. Judging this class was always difficult, and when she looked along the line and kept seeing the great horse, she knew it was going to be very difficult indeed. She looked carefully at every competitor, but her eyes always came back to Bonny. All the rabbits were very sweet. The falcon was impressive. The dogs were charming. The piglet was cute. But Bonny was magnificent. First prize to Mr. Skipton and Bonny, she announced, and everyone cheered. As the Rosette Award was presented, a man came to take a photograph for the local newspaper. It looked as though the great horse knew all about her prize as she posed there, dignified and beautiful. John, too, stood very erect and proud, but unfortunately, every time the photographer clicked the camera, Bonny pushed the bowler hat over the farmer's eyes. It was a mare's way of showing her love, but I couldn't help wondering how the picture would come out. After the show, I went back to Dale Close to help John undress Bonny, and I went with them down the hill to the field by the river. As we approached, Dolly came trotting up from the river, whining with pleasure to see her friend and companion again. Her foot has quite healed now, I said, noting the horse's even stride. In the gentle evening light, we watched the two horses hurry towards each other. Then for a long time they stood rubbing their faces together. Look at that, said old John, with one of his rare smiles. Bonny is telling Dolly all about her big day. Oh, there's the photograph. Bonny takes first prize in the family pets class, Dowerby and Halton Times. That was the newspaper picture. The end.